We are delighted to have Serene Diamond, the UK National Statistician, to open the Economic Measurement 2020 conference. So I'll hand over immediately to Ian for his opening remarks.
Mary, thank you very much. And can I welcome everyone to this first virtual conference, this fourth conference of ESCoE. Just to say, in welcoming everyone, this is an auspicious week for ONS, because we also welcome Sam Beckett to ONS. Sam will be known to many people as the joint head of the Government Economic Service, and she has come in as second permanent secretary. And so we're absolutely delighted to be working with her. And can I just also start by saying what a privilege and pleasure it's been to work with Rebecca over the last year or so, and how much I'm looking forward to continuing that. Just in starting to say a few words, I wonder if we could just reflect a little bit on the context in which we find ourselves. We find ourselves in a context clearly where COVID-19 over everything that we see, but I do feel we need to recognize that we do not have, if you like, some things that are done with COVID and some things that are, if you like, business as usual, because my view very clearly is that COVID is with us for some time, and that we need to see this as usual as including COVID in our nation. And I think that means an enormous amount for what we do, because in that context, in the context in which we find ourselves just at the moment, it does seem to me that there can be very, very, very few, a tiny number of economic statistics that will not change, that will not need innovation, that will not need exciting new ways of collecting them, or of finding new measures to measure them. And so I think that the need for ESCoE has never been greater, nor has the need been for the sorts of things that ESRC are brilliantly doing through their Administrative Data Research Network, which we at ONS are privileged to be partners in. And I think it will be inspiring to hear Anna following these few words of welcome from me. At the same time as the pandemic came, we were just finishing our strategy, our new strategy at ONS. And I wonder if I could just say a couple of minutes about this new strategy, and then reflect on how that links in with the context in which we find ourselves, but also how the work of ESCoE feeds into it. Our strategy has four key elements. First, to be radical. We absolutely, as a National Statistics Institute, have to be radical in the way we collect data, radical in what we collect, radical in how we analyze, and critically, deeply radical in the questions that we ask. We need to be doing things that National Statistics Institute, which you are on the outside say, I didn't know they did that, that I didn't know they addressed this really new important question. We can't do that without real hard work with those people developing methods, and it is, to me, a national and indeed international effort that we need to make that happen. Secondly, we aim to be ambitious to be at the heart of making policy and informing policy for our nation, and indeed again beyond our boundaries. To do that, ONS, in my opinion, absolutely has to engage. We maintain our independence by the way we collect data, but we have to be outreaching and engaging with the academic sector, engaging with the private sector, engaging with all parts of civil society. And we need to be saying things that you say, oh, that wasn't so what. This is really exciting. So radical and ambitious, but critically also, we need to be inclusive. I'm very, very clear in my mind that we have never, as a nation, been really inclusive in the way that we collect data, in the things that we ask of people, or indeed in the way that we analyze data. That's why one of the first things I've done, delayed a little by the pandemic, has been to set up an inclusive data task force. Dame Moira Gibb will be chairing that for us over the autumn. And I'm really excited about the way that we will be thinking through how we can be incredibly inclusive in all aspects of data collection and analysis, something that I don't think happens enough, frankly. And we will also absolutely bring that inclusivity to our staff, to building talent, whatever people's backgrounds, and to working across boundaries to ensure that we are developing new capacity, the sorts of capacity that ESCoE is doing so well with its work with early career researchers and new PhD students. And finally, sustainable. Sustainable is not just about ensuring our planet, although clearly it is, and we will do everything we can to provide the multivariate and multifaceted data that the government will need to achieve its net zero ambitions. But it is also sustainable in the way that we have the staff and the techniques and the methods to be able to produce the kind of analysis that we need. Again, this is where ESCoE comes in, and why I think it's incredibly important that we are seeking to build on that partnership over the next few years. Can I move to say a few words now about ESCoE? I mean, this is now something that has really, I think, built, still hosted and led by NIESR, and isn't that brilliant? But at the same time now really including a large partnership across the academic world and increasingly working with other national statistics institutes. And I'm delighted that my good friend Anil Arora is going to be speaking at this conference. I also think we should remember that this initiative built out of the great report that Charles Bean did for ONS a few years ago, and we really are at the moment just trying to turbocharge the finish of that. In the last little while, we've seen an enormous set of innovations across social stats in ONS as we respond to the pandemic. And we now need, I think, really to start to really build faster, quick indicators for economic statistics. And that's why I really welcome the fact that we are absolutely now working through this conference to build a new team of people, some new really exciting ideas. And so thanks to all those who have made this conference happen despite the challenges of the pandemic. I've been lauding ESCoE for its great work encouraging early career researchers and PhD students. And at this stage, I'm not quite clear which early career team Martin Wheel is on, but Martin, thank you for all you've done with Anna Galvao to build the scientific committee so strongly, and also thanks to Sarah Shepherd and Caroline Lewis for the organisation that they have put in. So finally from me, welcome to this conference. Congratulations to ESCoE, both on the things that it's been doing, but on bringing this wonderful conference together. But you know, I've highlighted some of the things we're thinking about in our strategy, and it seems to me that the only way we're going to achieve that is by a real partnership with the kinds of exciting academic and other initiatives that we'll be hearing about at this conference. Yesterday, I said to the senior team that for me, the success of this conference and the success of our partnership will be how many of the papers that are presented at this conference have turned in 6 months into statistics that we are producing, publishing, and are being used across our nation and beyond our nation's boundaries. You may say, oh, that can never happen, but in the context of reporting international mortality comparisons as a international mortality result of COVID, I mean, John Mulbauer, known to many of you, did some work in March. We had that published as part of one of our bulletins by early May. So we are absolutely, and I'm saying to my colleagues, we absolutely need to be ready to respond to the exciting initiatives that are going to come from ESCoE. I realize that in order to get things into economic statistics, it's a two-way conversation. For my part, I am absolutely encouraging, insisting to my colleagues that we are ready to receive. So Mary, thank you for the opportunity to welcome everyone. We are ready to receive, and so let's hear about some of the exciting things that we are going to be able to receive. Mary, thank you very much.
Right. And thank you very much, Ian, for very good comments to start off this, what should be a very exciting conference. So we start the conference with our first keynote speaker, and we're very pleased to welcome Anna Vignoles, who is currently Professor of Education at University of Cambridge, but will shortly be leaving Cambridge to take up the position of Director of the Leverhulme Trust. Many of us know Anna very well. She's a distinguished researcher in the economics of education, with a particular focus on issues to do with the relationship between education, social mobility, and education, and the skills that are generated for the labour market. Anna wears various hats, and she will talk about this during her talk, but she's an extensive user of data, and she is very well placed to talk about the benefits and the potential for the use of administrative data in research. Okay, so I'll hand over to Anna, but before doing so, just housekeeping rules. Anna will talk for 40 minutes. We'll then take some questions, and if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box, and then I will pick out a few people from that, questions from that, and ask those people to ask their question of Anna at the end. So if you want to ask a question, you must type into the Q&A box. So I'll hand over to you, Anna, to start your talk.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you for the kind invitation and introduction. I'm just going to share my slides, if I can get to do that. I think we'd be used to it from now. There we go. Excellent. Hopefully you can all see my slides. Let me know if you can't. So thank you again for inviting me to do this talk. I'm not actually going to talk about my own research in much detail today, but I couldn't resist the opportunity to talk about what I think is the future for administrative data in terms of using it effectively to inform government policy, and indeed to think about how we might use it in more effective ways to improve our public services. And as Ian rightly said, I think there's not really anything at the moment that we can say that doesn't have at least some COVID dimension to it. And indeed, I think that's definitely true of the way in which we've been using administrative data recently, and indeed the opportunities to use it in different ways in the future. So I will touch on that as I go through. But I hope that what I have to say today is also taken as a sort of longer term plan, if you like, for the way that I think the UK could be usefully using administrative data to even better effect than it already does. So as Mary said, I've got a number of different hats on, so it's worth reminding you what they are. I'm a member of the ESRC Council and indeed on the ADIUK board. ADIUK is the Administrative Data Research UK Centre, research centre essentially, that's been set up to help academics access administrative data, to help government use administrative data to good effect in terms of determining, public policy and public services. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. I'm also a trustee of the Nuffield Foundation, and the reason why that's relevant is Nuffield too has been worrying about the use of data, particularly administrative data in research, and have set up the Ada Lovelace Institute, and I'll talk about that during my talk. But I guess first and foremost, I should say that all the comments are my own, they're personal comments. And secondly, that I'm also speaking as an academic who's spent the best part of 15, 20 years using administrative data and trying to access administrative data, sometimes to no avail, to ask a lot of different research questions. So I think I'll be giving that perspective as well. So the good news is we've made progress. If I'd been giving this talk 5 years ago, clearly we would have still felt the need to make the case for the benefits of administrative data and research. And I think we're well past that now. It is really quite self-evident that the huge, vast array of data collected by the government for various forms of administration is really, really useful in research. It's also vital that we interrogate that data, both in terms of using it to think about how we can do better policy development and indeed evaluation of policy, but also, and I think this is sort of quite salient at the moment, how we can understand and improve the operation of government. Our public services are a vast endeavour and very challenging at the moment, particularly during COVID. We collect huge amounts of data even during COVID, and the extent to which we can use that data to better understand some of the problems that we're encountering in delivering public services will be extremely useful. But that might sound a bit negative. I think it's also worth highlighting in a really positive way the extent to which administrative data has been used widely during this pandemic. And I would just add to Ian's comments about sort of ONS being ambitious and radical, and say that I think it's really obvious to many of us in the academic community and beyond just how much ONS has done in terms of the effort to deal with COVID and the repercussions of COVID on the statistics front. It really has been very impressive. And I think one of the reasons why it's been so successful and impressive is partly due to the kinds of partnership working that Ian was alluding to. And indeed that sort of idea of partnering up across government, academia, ONS, etc., is going to be a running theme through my talk. But getting back to the way that administrative data has already been used, obviously they used it to identify those with the greatest health risk. It's being used all over the place to try to monitor and respond to labour market conditions. It's been used to understand the regional impacts of COVID, because COVID is not landing equally on all sectors and all individuals, and the costs, particularly not so much of the infection, but the costs of how we're responding to the infection are going to land very differently in different parts of the UK. And that's just a sort of few kind of very quick illustrations of the way that administrative data has been used during this pandemic. You could also perhaps say that the use of administrative data during the pandemic has also illustrated limitations, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So as I said, I don't think we really need to make the case for using administrative data anymore, but I think it is worth reflecting why it's so valuable. In a strange way, the fact that the administrative data is not deliberately collected for research purposes makes it inherently interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. One of the challenges in devising either survey collections or use of experimental data, etc., is that they tend to be framed from a particular perspective, and often that's a disciplinary perspective. Now, obviously, there are many projects that span disciplines and are multidisciplinary, but by and large, what we often find is that research data can be fairly targeted at particular disciplines. The nice thing about administrative data, at least in the way, for example, we've been using it recently to think about the impact of COVID on schools, is that you're bringing in data from lots of different sources, whether that's DWP or Department for Education, and it naturally gives you different perspectives on the problem that you're looking at. So I think it really does encourage interdisciplinary working. And then coming back to Ian's point, and it's great to hear what ONS is doing on the inclusion front, but this is a major, major issue about the extent to which different people are represented in different data. And I think we need to be quite careful here. So it's really clear that administrative data has a huge potential advantage in that many of the people that we can't get to respond to surveys, are not represented in our surveys, will be in the administrative data. So it has a real strength in that respect. But I think at the moment there is a tendency to also assume that the administrative data is, if you like, the gold standard. But there are obviously people who are missing from our administrative data. And we don't have to go very far to think about how that lands in terms of undocumented migrants and lots of other groups that tend to be even missing from the administrative data. And that's a real challenge when you're trying to devise policy. So I think we need to be careful here. And actually what we need is combinations of data to kind of tell us more on the front of who's included and who's not. But first and foremost, because administrative data is essentially generated by the activities of government, when we implement policy, naturally we turn to administrative data to evaluate it. And this is an area that I still feel has been neglected. We've done a huge amount in terms of opening up some key administrative data for research purposes, but it's also true that in a large number of government departments, policy is still rolled out in a way that makes it very hard to evaluate, and certainly the potential for administrative data to be used to better effect to do rigorous evaluation with some sort of treatment and control is still not being fully realized. And I think that's an area that we could do a lot better on. And sadly, I think that COVID, sort of in a strange world that we live in, has given us an opportunity there because COVID, as I said, is landing differently on different groups, plus the fact that we often don't know what the right answer is. So we are genuinely trying to explore different policy options. It would make much more sense to think about building in the evaluation of the different policy options we take, particularly during this sort of critical moment. And then, as I said at the beginning, the other issue that I think has been rather neglected is thinking about the way research can be used, using administrative data, but to understand the operations of government. I think there's a tendency in research terms to look at a policy and say, did it work, did it not? Look at the impact on outcomes. That's generally what academics have done when they've looked at administrative data. But administrative data tell you a huge amount about the running and the operations of government. And there's a lot of potential there to get more stuck into the granularity of the data, how it's collected, and to better understand where issues arise. Now, a lot of that work, of course, is going on within government, and rightly so. They're charged with delivering the public services. It makes sense that they're doing internal analyses to try and understand where the barriers are, where the hiccups, which bit works, which bit doesn't. But that does limit, I think, the scope for doing radical changes and to really thinking about how we could do this much better if you're not getting the external perspective that you would get if you had academics looking at that issue. So I also wanted to sort of give an example of the use of administrative data, this time in New Zealand, to kind of illustrate some of the things that I've been talking about its potential. Terry Moffat and her team have been using the New Zealand integrated data infrastructure. It links a whole range of administrative data, crime records, health records, social welfare records. And that in and of itself is perhaps no longer innovative in the sense that we also are linking, or at least some of those data here in the UK. But what they've also managed to do is link it up to a rich cohort study called the Dunedin study. And I think by doing that last step, there's real potential to get a much better grip on causality when thinking about public policy. And what they've done to good effect is use it to develop some indicators to try to predict the extent to which a child down the line will be a heavy user of public services. What they've also done is try to monetize that. So this is a very practical attempt to use administrative data linked to the survey data to try to understand what predictors we might have in the administrative data that can tell us whether, you know, this child age 10 is likely to be the person that's going to need a whole range of public services, health, crime, etc., when they get older. And to think about that in the framework of prevention. So obviously the objective here is to identify the huge costs that some individuals and groups place in terms of public services, so that you can more positively intervene earlier, making the economic case for the costs of that intervention. So it's a very balanced project. Now, it's not without its ethical challenges, and we're all very familiar after this summer's A-level issues, shall we say, of the problems of algorithms. And there are huge ethical issues that arise when you're using any kind of data, but particularly government administrative data, to predict particularly negative outcomes. So here you're using administrative data to predict negative child outcomes. You know, there's lots of potential there for misuse or for stereotyping people, etc. So alongside this kind of project, you also need to be thinking about the ethics of using data in this way. It's very important, of course. But the project has had some really interesting findings, may not come as a surprise to those who provide public services, but the data has been used to good effect to justify investment in public services. A timely moment to be discussing that as we come up to the comprehensive spending review. And what the project has found is that a very small proportion of the population are very heavy users of particular public services, and they account for the majority of costs. And they have successfully managed to get some early life indicators that are in the administrative data that you can use to predict those who are going to be such heavy users of public services. And obviously the way they've done that is to confirm whether or not those relationships make sense and have some degree of causality or potential causality, as illustrated in the Dunedin study. So it's the linking of the survey that allows them to do that. And they've also managed to quantify the costs so that you can make an economic case to Treasury for intervention. So with that kind of project in mind, and bearing in mind some of the ethical issues that arise from it, but also the potential, huge potential to start thinking very differently about our public services, to think about investing in prevention rather than identifying problems later on and then trying to invent policies to fix them. So if we think about that huge potential, how far is the UK along on that road? As I said, 5 years ago, before, for example, ADIUK came along and before ADIUK started working with the ONS, there were still efforts to open up administrative data. So ADIUK is not a new initiative. This is a long-term kind of battle, I would say, it's not too strong a word, to try and use administrative data for research. And even though we've had successes in recent years, it has and continues to be a real challenge. And that's true even in the pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those data issues in a sec, but I think at the heart of the problem that we have at the moment is that we're still not really sure whose data it is. Obviously, GDPR and other concerns about privacy have certainly made us appreciate that personal data is both critically important and must be used ethically, and that the public has huge public privacy concerns if it's wrongly used. But there's a big difference between saying that some administrative data is personal to the individual and needs a high level of protection versus thinking that the data sort of belongs to the state, or even more specifically that it belongs to a particular government department and therefore sort of can only be used for the purposes of that government department. That has been a rather default position, understandably, because that was the way the law was framed. It's been the position for a while, and that's starting to shift. And that's when I think we're going to unlock some of the real potential of administrative data, when it becomes the default position that we share data across government departments, certainly at a minimum, ideally when we share across departments and other bona fide researchers, and that transparency of data essentially becomes the default position. I think this has major advantages in terms of helping us develop holistic policy. Otherwise, you end up with policies from one department that contradict the policies or pull against the policies from another. So I think doing a more holistic approach it's vital we share the data. but also going back to the New Zealand study, if we're serious about a more preventative model, we have to get serious about data linkage and sharing that data. And I'm going to talk through some projects that ADIUK are just doing that. And as I said, we need to take the ethical scrutiny very, very, very seriously and take the public with us on this. So I've set up a series of problems, but I'm actually quite optimistic in the space of administrative data, or certainly more optimistic than I was a few years ago. And that's because UKRI, ESRC, MRC have invested heavily in infrastructure investment to try and open up administrative data to researchers, whether that's ADIUK, which is tasked with the social data side of things, or HDIUK, tasked with the health side of things. And other players, including Nuffield, coming into the space are also trying to constructively consider all the challenges when we use administrative data in this way. So I feel like we're taking this seriously and we're putting some serious resource behind it. So ADIUK, for those of you who are not familiar with it, I think most of you will be, so I'll be brief, is a partnership. It's a partnership with ONS, but it's also partners with partners in devolved nations. And the idea behind ADIUK is that it will link together different administrative data sets and facilitate access to researchers. I think what probably makes ADIUK different, however, from previous attempts to do this, is it has at its heart the idea that the only way we're really going to open up administrative data for research is to do it in proper partnership with government. That means asking questions of interest to government. It means sharing expertise both ways, government expertise for academics and academic expertise for government, and to work together to try and see the public benefit of using administrative data in this way. And there are challenges. So one person's, good partnership working with government is another person's concern around all of the research priorities being driven by the government of the day, as opposed to taking a longer term perspective or taking a different perspective and asking research questions that perhaps are not of interest to this particular government, but will be of interest to the public and future governments. So that it is not without its challenge to work quite so closely government on these issues, but it is vital that we do so because these data are large, complex, they have legal barriers to access, and it's only by convincing everybody, both partners, that the value can be had from doing this that we're likely to succeed. And indeed, the ESRC, as you can see there in the last bullet, has put a big slug of money into this, and the first year funding for an even longer term investment has just been signed up. So it's looking really positive. I won't go through all the partners that make up ADIUK. They're all on the slide somewhere, but I take too long to go through them all. But I think what's really important is that it is a partnership. I think also it's important that we've been learning a lot from our partners in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, who in many respects have sort of moved ahead on the administrative data agenda. I think the UK as a whole is catching up, but there are still issues around data sets in England. And obviously working with the ONS in this partnership has proved very successful in recent years. So what is ADIUK actually doing? It's all very well to talk sort of in high level terms about what administrative data might or might not do for us. But I think it's not until we actually get those projects up and running and we get academic access to the data and indeed sharing and expertise across government and academia that we're going to start to feel that we're really making progress here. So one project which I really like is Data First. So this is a data linkage project initiated by the Ministry of Justice, who would like to link their civil, family and criminal justice data sets, which previously have been separate. Obviously, their objective is to understand users of the justice system better, understand their pathways. Going back to COVID again, COVID has placed enormous strain and presented some real challenges for the justice system, as we can all imagine. And this kind of data will help us understand in real time and retrospectively exactly who's been affected and indeed come up with potential solutions as to how we can minimize the impact. So this linking of data for Ministry of Justice actually predated COVID, because there's a longer term agenda here about understanding who users of justice services are, but it's, I think, come to the fore, particularly in COVID or during COVID. And I think the nice thing about this project is it's been an incredible partnership, a really positive partnership. It's got 2 academics in key positions. There's an academic lead and an academic external champion. And so by doing that, it's ensured that academic expertise can come into this project at the earliest point. So rather than have data linkage done by Ministry of Justice and then the data made available and academics do projects on them, you've had expertise right the way through the whole linking process. And so what does ADIUK and indeed the Data First team think they're going to get out of the project? Well, as you can imagine, there's a whole range of outcomes. I'm not going to go through them all. The key point here is we need to really improve our understanding of who's in the justice system and what pathways do they take through it. That's actually at the heart of all this. You can't do that unless you link the data. You can't devise policy as effectively as you might without linking the data. So that's at the sort of heart of what we're trying to do. But it's also about the sharing of kind of expertise on these data sets. They're very large, very complicated, and really helping the Ministry of Justice in particular improve operations off the back of better understanding of these data. And of course, improve transparency as well. Another example is one that's close to my own heart, because this is data I've used, is the Longitudinal Educational Outcomes data set. And this is a linked data set with school data from the National Pupil Database, higher education data from HESA, tax data from HMRC, and benefits data from DWP. So this data has been around for a few years now. I was trying to work out how long. It's actually 4 years, I think. And so this is, in a sense, not new data, but up to now, what's happened is that one team, which I was privileged to be part of, was given the data. And so academic access has been very limited. And indeed, I should say 2 teams, actually. Another team was also given the data, Sandra McNally's team at the London School of Economics, who were looking at vocational education. But broadly speaking, both the IFS team and the LSE teams were under contract of DFE. We have found some really interesting findings with the data. For those of you worrying about this year's bumper crop going into higher education, the good news is that up to now, at least, a degree has maintained, is maintained as a reasonably good option. It's leading to relatively high earnings for many, but not all graduates. It's also highlighted that variation in outcomes for graduates. And in terms of my own work, what it's certainly done is show the different pathways that students from low-income backgrounds tend to take through higher education, and indeed the different outcomes they get from their higher education. So from a social mobility and an inequality perspective, this data has been really vital. That tends to get lost in the debate about what's a degree worth. But actually, one of the most insightful aspects of this data, in my opinion, has been to show the very, very different trajectories that you get when you are looking at students from lower income backgrounds. Now, these data, as I said, have been accessed by these teams. They've been used in policy making, such as the Auger Review. Dame Shirley Pearce has at least referenced it and used it in her Teaching Excellence Framework Review, which is not yet published, but maybe soon. So there's no doubt that these data have been highly important and useful to government. But the limitation, of course, is that because the questions and the data were shared with a sort of a relatively narrow range of people, mostly economists, we've only had one perspective on this data. And I think it's really important that one of the real benefits of ADIUK has been to think about ways of getting data such as this and opening it up to a wider range of researchers. And indeed, we're looking for Leo to come online shortly, precisely so that it can be accessed by researchers beyond those initial 2 economic themes. But what will Leo do for us in the future? Leo is actually really vital, I think. I think if we look back in a few years' time on COVID, its impact, our response to COVID, one of the big issues that's going to be really obvious to us in retrospect, if it's not obvious now, is that the young have paid and will continue to pay a very high price for this pandemic. Literally in terms of having schooling disrupted, university disrupted, but also in terms of their prospects in the labour market, as labour markets get particularly difficult. And LEO is going to be really, really important as a data source to help us try and understand that. It's not enough just to look at who's working X hours in the labour market and how much do they earn. We need to understand the trajectories that young people have taken through this period so that we can focus on those COVID generations and understand the difficulties that some, but probably not all, are having in terms of the transition into the labour market. And it's only by sort of understanding those trajectories, understanding which students are having real difficulties, which ones are thriving, that we can make good policy. And as I said, it's really great news that ADIUK and ONS have managed to secure access to LEO for a wider range of researchers who can look at the data in different ways towards the end of 2020. There's another project which is perhaps doing what I've just said isn't enough, but it's looking at wages and employment, which is obviously vital, particularly at the moment, but even before the pandemic. What we were really looking at in the labour market is longer term outcomes and impacts from the 2008 Great Recession. So we've had an ongoing issue around inequality in the labour market. And this project is a nice project from the University of West of England, UCL, City and NISA collaborating. And they are linking data on hours from ASHE and earnings indeed, with data on firms from the IDBR. And then, and this is the unique bit, the link to the 2011 census to get the individual characteristics. So that's going to produce a very rich data source. And I think one of the things that it'll be most useful for is understanding the issue of pay progression and how that develops into wage inequality. Two issues about which we could do with learning more, and that we need the link to the census to really be able to understand that and understand the characteristics of those with low pay and the characteristics of those who are not experiencing the pay progression that you would hope that they would get as they pass through the labour market. And then finally, just on the ADIUK activity, obviously it's been very active during COVID. Again, I won't go through it all, but all of the different partners have been doing their bit in terms of either contributing to the data task force or doing impact assessments, analysis of COVID deaths. The point I wanted to make here was that we need ongoing and persistent investment in our data infrastructure. We need, organizations like ADIUK, which are big investments that are permanent, to ensure that when issues such as COVID arise, people can actually access data, access expertise, and we are, if you like, ready to go. One of the challenges, I think, has been that in the past, individual projects might have been fantastic, but we haven't had that infrastructure to ensure that the data and the linked data could be made available to others on an ongoing basis. So I mentioned back at the beginning, and just for the last bit of my talk, I wanted to talk about ethics. It's really very important that we take this seriously. I think as researchers, it's obvious to us why we would use this data in this way. We also know we're not trying to do anything bad. We also know that we're careful with the data. So it may feel like there's not a problem, but I think there is an issue about building trust. And the Ada Lovelace Institute that the Nuffield Funds was set up to do that. It was set up to really think quite deeply and rigorously about when it's appropriate to share data and when it's not, to get the different diverse voices in the room. There are people who feel very strongly about privacy. This is an issue that needs to be taken seriously. It is not always a good idea to link data. It is not always a good idea to use algorithms to predict outcomes if it's going to be used in an unfortunate way in policy. And we do need this kind of institution to, if you like, hold us to account. And I wanted to highlight the fact that others, I guess, share that view. When you look at the partners that Ada has as a pretty impressive list, but it also spans those who are very focused on data right through to those who are thinking about other issues, including privacy, etc. So it's a good space for us to have a very serious discussion about how we want to approach the issue of data privacy, which can't be ignored. And I just wanted to sort of mention a couple of projects which I thought were quite interesting and sort of illustrate the point. So ADA has managed to produce a book or a PDF on the use of surveillance data during COVID. I mean, that's a good example where instinctively we want to get rid of this virus. Instinctively, we really need to know what everybody's doing. But equally, there's also issues around using surveillance in inappropriate ways. And having sort of the institute set up already, it meant that they were able to respond quite quickly to starting to think about these issues and put them into the public debate. Similarly, in the issues that arose from Black Lives Matter, and particularly focusing on the representation or lack of it of some groups in our data when we're making public policy, which, as Ian said, is really, really vital. But overall, I think it's important that we pay as much attention to building public trust in using data in this way as we do to getting the data linkage done and doing some exciting projects. If we don't do both those things simultaneously, we will fail. So are we there yet? Well, I think there is still some work to do. I think we've proven the value of administrative data, and we're doing it, if you like. We've proven the value of linkage to surveys, and it's not just the Dunedin study that's doing that. If you look at all of the, say, the cohort studies or Understanding Society, they've all got fantastic administrative data linkages now. I'm sure they want more. I'm sure they've had challenges in getting those administrative data linkages. Like I said, the job is not done here. I think there are ongoing issues with that. But nonetheless, the value of the administrative data linkages are really obvious. But I think where we need to do an awful lot more, and where this pandemic has really revealed a gap, is in the value of linkage to whether you call it transactional or commercial data. Clearly during COVID, what's become obvious is that some of the administrative data is collected at intervals, and those intervals are quite long. When you're trying to do real-time analysis of who's moving where or who's buying what, administrative data isn't necessarily going to help you. You need transactional data, and most of that transactional data is owned by private companies. And so here we have an even bigger challenge. We have the challenge of trying to get commercial organizations to engage in the use of data for public value and public services and research, as opposed to the use of data for commercial advantage. So that's the first challenge. And the second challenge, of course, is that once you bring private organizations into the mix, people get much more concerned about privacy. Well, it's interesting, depends on your country. In some countries, they're more worried about the government having the data. In some countries, they're more worried about commercial organizations having data. The UK is in the latter group. But if we miss the opportunity to take advantage of that transactional data, I think we really are missing a very big opportunity, because so much of it can tell us the bits that the administrative data can't. And going back to an earlier point that Ian made about representation, the other thing about some of that transactional and commercial data is it can tell us about things that aren't in the administrative data and people who aren't in the administrative data. And that's really important too. And indeed, you know, just to sort of end on what we're doing at the moment and what we might need to do, I would say that during this pandemic, it's become obvious that data is a challenge. There are two organizations I've been involved with Delve, which was convened by the Royal Society, worked with Simon Burgess and Rich Wilkinson and Ines Hassan to do the report on getting schools back, for example. That was through Delve. It's using data-driven approaches to think about how we might respond to COVID. It's done some great work, but it's also really highlighted some of the challenges we have at getting access to data in a timely fashion. And indeed, Delve is about to put out a report that highlights just that issue, which is that we're not there yet. There is data that would be useful in fighting COVID or responding to COVID, and that we need to do even more to try and secure access to that data. And interestingly, one of the issues is about being clear what data might be useful. A lot of the data that's out there, the organizations that hold that data don't necessarily see the data as valuable. But once you pull together interdisciplinary teams who are thinking about the problem from a research perspective, that data is valuable. I'd also highlight the Trinity Challenge, which was launched earlier this week, which is a partnership, again, focused on the use of data in this and future pandemics. And they too are particularly concerned about trying to get commercial and transactional data, in this case, more readily available to be used in the fight against COVID. So I think this is an area where there's an awful lot more to do. So just to conclude, what does the future sort of look like? I think there are a couple of points. First of all, administrative data, and particularly linked to survey and transactional data, is going to be at the heart of our data infrastructure for many years to come. We're not going to be able to seriously understand even, the short-term, let alone the long-term impacts of COVID, without serious attention to making sure that we have the right data that can help us answer the questions that we have, particularly about the economic impact. And if we're going to do that, it can't be serendipitous projects, sort of linking a couple of data sets together and coming up with fabulous answers, however fabulous those answers are. It needs to be off the back of a much more serious investment in data infrastructure. And that investment means organizations like ADIUK, but also it means investment in people. And I think, again, this was something Ian highlighted in his talk. One of the challenges we found through the pandemic is we still have a shortage of data science expertise. And looking forward, I can't see any reduction in the demand for those types of skill. And what we want, really, thinking about Ian's idea of being ambitious, I think the UK should be ambitious. We should be ambitious for the kinds of data infrastructure that we can have in this country. We should be ambitious for opening it up in a transparent way and using it for research across academia and government. And I think we should also be ambitious in terms of the numbers of people that we think should have a variety of different skills that allow them to interrogate such data in a useful way. So that, I think, is the future of data over the next few years. And I'll stop there, Mary. Thanks.
So thank you, Anna, for a very stimulating talk. I haven't got my video on. No. Okay. So we have a little bit of time for questions. I'm seeing the Q&A. There's nothing there, and I'm just worried it may not be working. If you want to ask Anna a question, could you please just type your name in the Q&A? So while we wait for that, I thought this was a very stimulating talk. I mean, as a researcher, I often find issues of access quite frustrating. I don't really have a very good handle on why I can't get access to data. So, I mean, what are the main bottlenecks? Is it the fact that often in these departments who are sharing data, there's not the required skills of the people who are doing the sharing? Are there bottlenecks there, or is it more attitudinal? We're still in this position where departments really look at data as their own, for their own purposes, and are not looking at this wider access. Yeah.
So, I mean, the downside of being old is that you've been around a bit and had these conversations about access to administrative data over a very long period of time. And in my experience, there are three. They're given in a particular order, but the last one's the most important. The first is there's a legal barrier. The second is that we're concerned about privacy and issues around risk for the department. And then the third is also priorities and lack of resource. And I think it's the third one that has been quite a significant barrier. In other words, if your project is not going to be directly relevant and useful to that government department, they are not given spare resources, particularly now, to do the necessary preparation that might need to occur in order to get that data set available to researchers. And so they would then, say, well, it's not in our priority area, and then might even fall back on, and we're not sure the public would like it anyway. And by the time you get to that bit in the conversation, you're not getting access to the data. So the whole point of the sort of partnership working that ADIUK has proposed is to start at least with questions that the government department itself needs to answer, or the government as a whole, from an interdisciplinary or interdepartmental perspective, need to answer. Because then you've kind of solved the third problem. And ADIUK has also invested resource in government departments in terms of expertise and funding to try to prepare some of these data sets for research access, because it's not a free process. That's another thing that it's been doing.
Mary,
we have quite a number. Oh, sorry, Ian, do you want to come in there? Yes, please.
Do you mind?
Yes, don't do, please.
I agree with everything that Anna has just said, but I just wanted to add something, because in the last couple of weeks, the government has really, I think, made a major step forward and empowered ONS together with the Cabinet Office really to ensure that linking administrative data is much more possible than, for all the reasons Anna has absolutely rightly enabled. And so I would say that the issue for us is we do not wish to be saying to departments, can we have your data? We wish to be saying to departments, together with your data, we can answer the following research questions. And so my plea and my reason for interjecting, thank you, Mary, for letting me do that, is that if colleagues have research ideas and research questions, it is then much easier for us to be able to overcome both the ethics and the access. And so I urge people, and I know I might regret saying this, but I urge people to write to me if they've got questions, because then we can start to work with them. My colleagues will work with them in order to do everything we can to enable access.
Thank you, Ian. So we have a few questions. I'll take three. Sanjeev Mahajan, Diane Coyle and Joseph Haynes. So Sanjeev, you start. Please keep your questions short, because we have only about 10 minutes or 50 minutes.
Thank you, Mary. Can you hear me? Just want to check.
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anna, for an excellent presentation and your inputs as well, Ian. So very quickly, obviously there's huge amount of data out there. There's big data, public and private sector. Private sector have different challenges. In terms of different government departments, HMRC, DEFRA, etc., they've got a huge amount of data. You mentioned data linking. And in terms of data linking, it can only be done if you've got certain structures, classifications, frameworks that enable that. So you talked about lots of things for the future, very rich, very ambitious stuff. My question would be, if you had a single plea that could be fulfilled, what would you want the government of today, with the background of COVID, etc., to not think about, not consider as an ambition, but to deliver within 3 years? Something real.
Okay, so that's an excellent question and difficult one to answer. So we have core public services being used by individuals. And the same individuals, I suspect, but don't know, use the same public services as we, sort of founded the New Zealand project. We do not really understand the individual's journey through those public services and ways in which we could both make that smoother and reduce the cost. And so I would pick the big ticket items, whether that would be DWP, health, education, the big expensive public services that people use, and bring together their core characteristics and outcomes so that we would have a far better appreciation. For example, that you might want to spend money over here, I don't know, my field, education, to prevent money being spent over there. I think that is the real prize here, if you like, in terms of reducing the costs of delivering future public services. And we really need to do that, more now than ever, given other things happening.
And we have quite a number of questions now. So could I ask a few people to ask the question, then Anna answer as a group maybe. So Diane Coyle, and then Joseph Haynes, and then Martin Wheel. So Diane, it's up to you.
Thanks very much, Mary. Anna, you talked about the social value of private sector data, and I wonder if you could say a bit about how feasible you think that is and what your experience has been of engagement with the private sector for data access.
Joseph Haynes?
Yeah, my question related to the public's willingness to either explicitly give their data or have their data collected on them, and how that may have been affected by COVID. And I don't mean this at all to sound too dodgy in a way, but is this an opportune moment for statisticians to ask the question again of the public in their willingness to have data collected on them?
Yeah. And Martin?
I wanted to ask Anna, please, how far is the legislation clear on data sharing? Do you think the Digital Economy Act is adequate, or do you think further legislation might be needed?
Some great questions there, thank you. And in some ways, Diane and Joseph's question are actually, funnily enough, I think related. So Diane, is it difficult to get private organisations, private firms to share data for social good? My experience is yes, but equally, I would also say that during COVID, it's been much, much easier. And I think that illustrates the key point here, which is that the social good needs to be articulated, and the owners of the data are sort of convinced of the value of the sharing. Now, there are ways in which private sector and transactional data can be linked to other data sets that also give benefit to firms. And that, again, I suppose, is the equivalent of the partnership working that ADIUK has proposed for government and academia, where you're asking questions that are of interest to both parties. And I think that's the way you get the private sector to engage, COVID aside. Obviously, if the social good is obvious enough, I think they engage anyway. But that comes to Joseph's point. I know you should never waste a crisis. Yes, I do think this is a moment where we should be really, really talking about the value of this data and in its way it's been used to tackle COVID. So what I'd like to see over the next year as we come out of COVID is much more efforts on the part of ourselves and statisticians, etc., to talk about the value of this data. What I would be nervous about, however, is using it as a moment to kind of push through data sharing that in the cold light of day may backfire. I think we do need to take the ethics very, very seriously. And I thought the A-level issue was quite an interesting one, and we won't get into the details, but one of the real obvious points about it was that people would prefer someone else's prediction and a human's prediction to an algorithmic prediction. Just instinctively, they prefer it. And so I think there's a real danger of sort of pushing down that route too fast without really thinking about whether the public are happy to do that. But that said, yes, we should really be, talking about the value of the data that we've got at the moment and how it's being used. And then Martin, your question on the legislation. So, I mean, the big problem is that health and mental health and economic circumstances and social circumstances are also interrelated. It's extremely frustrating having legislation that sort of compartmentalizes particularly health and social data. And for me, that is a problem. I don't think it's an insurmountable one. So in other words, if you're asking me, can projects link data under the current legal framework? Yes, I mean, they're doing it. But I think it's made it unnecessarily difficult, particularly to bring in that health link. And I think that's not helpful. And I mean, if further legislation could come with more of a default position of transparency and sharing of government data, I think we would be better off with that.
Mary, can I add something in 1 second?
Yes.
Simply agree on what Anna has just said. All our public engagement, we've got a lot of citizens' juries and things that were happening pre-COVID and during COVID, are that people are very happy to share and to have their data shared so long as they understand, or it can be seen, that there is a social good in so doing. And I think that's a really important point. We've got to stop, if you like, patting people on the shoulder and saying, would you give me your health records for the last 20 years, please? We need to move it into a conversation about what the social good is in so doing. And with regard to legislation, look, I'm not going to say everything's perfect, but I would much rather we worked hard to enable things to happen rather than go into a 2-year process of more legislation and nothing happening in that process. And I think we can make things happen, and we're trying very hard to make sure that happens.
Thank you, Ian. And please do come in the next set of questions as well. I have 3 here from Emma Gordon, then Keisha Batarai and Isabella Bouchard-Palmisano. Sorry for the mispronunciation. Okay, so start with Emma.
Hi, Anna. So my question is, do you think the leaps forward that have been made in data sharing across government during COVID will lead to lasting improvements in data sharing culture? And do you think that extends to not just sharing within government, but sharing with external researchers?
And Keshab?
Hi, Anna. It was very interesting talk. I have a simple question, whether it makes sense. My question is, what is the current vision on integrating artificial intelligence or machine learning techniques in constructing new data sets?
And Isabella?
Hi, my question is, what is the balance between access to different data sets and the speedy access to the most recent set of administrative data, as policy analysis may emphasize the latter with research focused on the breadth of sources?
Thank you. So starting with Emma, do we think we've cracked it for the long term in terms of changing culture? I mean, this is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I'm sure it has been over the last decade, 15 years, but I do think we are changing the culture. I think the idea that we're all in it together and sharing data for the public good is becoming more central. It could still be derailed, obviously, and I think it's it's an ongoing issue and an ongoing battle. And I would say that the biggest barrier in the past to administrative data access has been a reluctance of government departments to share that for good reasons and sometimes not so good reasons. But we really need to keep that in the back of our mind, because that is an issue that we need to keep hammering on, and that we have to do that by making it really valuable for government departments. And then I'm going to come to Isabel's before coming back to you, Keshab. Having said that we need to work in partnership and make it obvious that this is of value to government departments, that actually raises a challenge. And if I was going to challenge anything Ian said, which I would never do naturally, but I think this issue of we have to ask the questions that are of interest to government. He's absolutely right. Of course you do. That's how you get access to the data. But I think in the back of our minds, we need to be mindful that, going back to a question I posed earlier, whose data is it and what purposes would we use it for? There are many social, economic, health and other related research questions that will not be of interest to the current government of the day. It is vital that we are not barred from using administrative data to ask those questions. But I do agree that we start by building the value for the government by working in partnership with them, but we mustn't lose that end goal in mind. And Keshab, I would say at the moment that is not a very well developed vision at all. I think that AI is also, what does it mean? It means different things to different people. It is being used, but for example, using it to predict service need in public services is still relatively controversial. So that is one of those issues that I would say we need to do a lot more public discussion on before we launch any kind of sort of algorithmic approach to some of the questions that we're asking. Now, I mean, using algorithms to construct better and cleaner data sets, I think that's going on in the background and that's fine. But in terms of using it to drive policy, we need to be a bit more cautious.
Mary, can I just agree with
Yes,
Anna?
go ahead, Ian. Yeah.
It's incredibly important that we are prepared to ask the widest range of questions, and we need to be able to ask questions which have the long view as well as the short view. My point was very much about enabling people to understand why there might be benefits in sharing. I think that's important. And with regards to Emma's question, can I just say, my colleagues at ONS are bored with me telling them 5 times a week, no going back. And we absolutely have to bottle every positive we have got from what has happened in the last few awful months and make sure that we work tirelessly to keep them going in the long term.
Thank you. There are 2 more questions, and John, Jeremy and Ian McKay. Now, I'm conscious you have like a couple of seconds to ask the questions because I think this session ends exactly at 12. So, John.
So were you referring to John Jeremy, Mary?
John Jeremy, yes, please.
Well,
and
I can see his question, so perhaps I can can give.
Yeah, now maybe you should have a look, just answer the two questions.
Yeah, so John's question is about, do we have concerns about relying on administrative data when it can be variable quality over time? And indeed, some administrative data sort of can be withdrawn. Absolutely, that's an issue. And I mean, of course, ONS does amazing work around, consistency of statistics precisely because of this problem of comparability over time. But I don't think we should stop using it just because there is that risk. What we should be very mindful of is, though, that these are not research-ready data sets that you just put on a website and go for it. These are data sets you have to understand their provenance, and that means investing in the data cleaning process as well. And in terms of Ian's question is about anonymization, and is enough being done to anonymize individual data so it can be released freely. I think a fair amount has been done on that, Ian. I think that one of the challenges, though, is understanding what we mean by anonymization, in the sense that the moment you link the data to richer data sources, or you link across different administrative data, obviously you increase the risk. That's an issue that still doesn't stop you using the data, and you can still make it anonymous, but it's more challenging. And I think it's communicating the fact that it is challenging, and communicating the fact that you're still aiming for anonymity that's been quite a challenge in some of these areas. But yeah, it's a work in progress on that one.
And Ian, a final word?
Well, I would like to say a word on John Jeremy's really important question. And I think that my own personal vision is that if we are able to use APIs to pull the pieces of data we need from many different data sources, then we only need to collect the data once, and then we can afford to collect data in a granular and proper way. Because we do need to remember that these data, brilliant as though they are collected for administrative purposes, not for research purposes. And that's why we absolutely need the ability to link not only with administrative data, but with many of the social surveys and understanding society and stuff like that, because it is so critical that we are able to answer questions in a granular way. And can I just say, I think Anna's presentation and answers have been brilliant. Thank you.